Good day, everyone. My name is Stephen David. I'm the Superintendent CEO of Park West School Division. I'm here today to talk to you about things to think about when you're considering evaluating your superintendent. Specifically, I'm hoping to give you some ideas to improve the practice of superintendent evaluation in your school division. The one thing to note prior to beginning is that this isn't intended to be a comprehensive overview of superintendent analysis. It's just highlighting some key things for consideration, and the hope would be that at your own board level in your division, it might spur some conversation to help you improve the practices for supervising and evaluating your educational leader. So in the package of materials that were delivered to you or made available on the website, talks about how this webinar will provide an overview of the principles of effective supervision, and in doing so it will redefine some of the perspective and context for evaluating superintendents. I'm going to suggest that we can do some things to maximize the effectiveness of evaluation of superintendents, and the key things that I'll be suggesting will be that we want these evaluations to be collaborative, efficient, and responsive. Now, this is just a simple graphic to frame the conversation, and I think it speaks to a lot of the important things that I'm going to be talking about today. So you have the zebra, unfortunately, getting a summative evaluation by the lion, and the lion tells him that, unfortunately, your performance hasn't been good, and we can take care of business now, or you can stop by at my office around lunchtime. So a couple of things that this would be reflective of bad practice. First of all, it's summative. There really doesn't appear to be any opportunities for growth or improvement. It's punitive, obviously, if the zebra is going to be devoured by the lion during lunchtime. And it also would suggest that it hasn't been very collaborative, because my perspective looking at the zebra, he's kind of sitting there meekly, and he likely just found out that he was unsuccessful in his performance, probably based upon criteria with which he wasn't familiar. So why is superintendent evaluation important? In any school division, leadership is the key, and your most important educational leader is your superintendent. So you need to make sure that your superintendent of your school division is growing and improving professionally. A lot of research, and many people would say that superintendent evaluation is one of the most important things, if not the most important thing a school board does. And the research would suggest this would be as important as things such as developing budget and developing long-term goals and strategies. Purpose of evaluation, whether you're evaluating teachers or educational assistants, secretaries, superintendents, a lot of the basic principles are common. However, there are some principles for superintendent evaluation that would be specific to that position given the nature of the position. So done correctly, an evaluation of a superintendent is a useful governance tool for multiple purposes. Obviously, it would be something that could drive school improvement, given that your superintendent is your educational leader for your school division and the board's agent for overseeing that school improvement. Superintendent evaluation is also very important for developing positive relationships between trustees and the superintendent. It clarifies leadership roles, not just in terms of what the superintendent is expected to do, but also in terms of what the board is expected to do and what the division is expected to do. It creates common understandings about the many things that happen in a school division. Again, not just the role of the superintendent, but it allows the board to provide direction to the superintendent about what their expectations are in terms of implementing the divisional plan or board directives. And like other forms of evaluation in the public sector, it provides a mechanism for accountability for the public. And all of those things are important. You'll notice that occasionally I'm looking to my left. I have two screens here, and I just need to forward the slide. In terms of current practice, I'm not suggesting that there isn't good practice in Manitoba for superintendent evaluation, but there's certainly a lot of variability because there's not a standard practice. A lot of boards do their own thing. Some of them use materials that have been developed by Manitoba school boards and Mass in conjunction. However, a lot of the research would suggest that superintendent evaluation does little to improve the superintendent performance, and it does little to improve school division effectiveness. So if I just extend this concept a little bit, think about your own division, what you do in terms of practice for superintendent evaluation. Some divisions do it faithfully and regularly and consistently on an annual basis. Some divisions have variations that they employ on a given school year, and other divisions perhaps aren't as intensive with the practice as some of their colleagues. So if you look at this diagram, the array of pictures, I think it speaks to the variety of things that evaluation, specifically superintendent evaluation, may be currently used for. Up in the top left, you have the gentleman being kicked by a colleague, and that would suggest that, like many superintendent evaluations, they're done for punitive reasons. Below it, the April 30th, that's a common evaluation deadline in many school divisions. In many cases, superintendent evaluations are done just because they need to be done. They're in policy, there's an expectation that boards do them, and they're done by a certain date. Then you have the image in the middle with the two people that are obviously in a bit of a confrontation. Sometimes superintendent evaluations can be contentious, and they can be things that draw wedges or drive wedges between the board and the superintendent, and that isn't a good practice. On the bottom is the person celebrating. You can take multiple perspectives on this, but in many cases, boards celebrate when they're done the superintendent evaluation just because often they're an onerous task and they're glad to be finished with them. In the top right, you have the lady with her hands on her head, a little bit exasperated and frustrated. That could be either a board member or superintendent, and it just reflects that sometimes that these can be challenging experiences for people involved in them. The young gentleman in the middle with the green and white shirt and the fist pump, I suppose that's the superintendent when he gets a positive evaluation. He's happy that his evaluation is completed, and he's happy that he's got a positive feedback from his board. And in the bottom right corner is the one that I would suggest would be the ideal model, and many boards do this already, so if you're currently doing it, it's not intended to be a criticism, but my perspective would be a collaborative model, an ongoing formative growth model would be the best practice in terms of what you want to do to evaluate and supervise your superintendent so that he improves or she improves her practice and becomes better at what they do. So that's the question that I just asked, and this is the question that I ask whenever I'm reflecting on evaluation at any level in my school division, whether it be educational assistants, custodians, teachers, maintenance people. The question has to be, whatever you're doing for supervision and evaluation, is that helping that employee to become better at what they do? So, reflecting on your own practice for superintendent evaluation, is what you're doing in your school division helping your superintendent get better? Because if it isn't, I would argue that you need to stop doing it immediately, because it's not just a paperwork task. It's not something to inform negotiations for salary. It's not something to help you get rid of a poor performing superintendent. It could be, but at its heart, and when it's done in its best possible way, supervision and evaluation is about making that person become better at what they do. So there's lots of different perspective on superintendent evaluation, but my perspective would be there are two key things that you need to do if you don't do them currently to improve your practice. Firstly, it has to do with making sure that you have time and a process. And the second thing, and I've suggested this previously, it has to be collaborative. So firstly, superintendent evaluation should be a process, not an event. In many cases, it's something that happens at the very end of the school year because you have to do it. And again, I'm not being critical. I'm not reflecting my own experience in Park West, which has been very positive. But from talking to colleagues, sometimes it's something that's done just in May and June, and you kind of scramble to get it done, and it's rushed. And sometimes it's not a positive experience just because of the time pressure. The second thing that is really critical is that superintendent evaluation has to be collaborative. It needs to be done with the superintendent and not to the superintendent. And I would suggest that this needs to happen right from the beginning. So it's likely that you'll be viewing this webinar at the beginning of the school year, and I would suggest that that is the best time to start the process of superintendent evaluation. I would suggest that using this collaborative model and having that as one of your key areas of focus, you need to sit down with the superintendent. It can be done very briefly, perhaps 15 or 20 minutes, and outline what your expectation is in terms of the process for supervision and evaluation. But then start the conversation about, very simply, what are the superintendent's goals for the school year, and what will the superintendent do to improve their practice? And I would suggest that collaborative model needs to be ongoing. You may want to schedule formally several times during the school year. We would sit down with the superintendent perhaps for a half hour to talk about what they're doing to get better. And sometimes you may want to use very simple benchmarks. If you have a conversation with your superintendent in September, one of your questions may be, what will you do to be a better superintendent by December 1st? It may seem to be a superficial question, but it's something that really gets people to focus on one or two key areas that they need to improve upon, and then you can have a conversation about what will you do to demonstrate that improvement in the next couple of months. In assessment of students, it's often referenced as chunking. Don't set goals in September and then not revisit them until the end of the school year. It's better to set goals, short-term goals, and revisit them, and if you've been successful in achieving them, set another series of goals for the next time period. And one of the challenges for superintendent evaluation is something I want to speak to quickly. And I'm going to preface this by saying that this is not intended to be a criticism of trustees or board members. And I'm just going to read it just as it's written here on the slide. The superintendent is the only employee in the entire organization who is supervised by multiple evaluators, all of whom typically are community members untrained in the evaluation of professional educators. Just to give you a little analogy, in my school division, we've been doing a lot of work in the past 5 or 6 years on improving teacher evaluation. And when we talked to our divisional principals about 5 or 6 years ago, and we asked them, what can we do to make teachers better in our school division? The first thing principals told us, and our first priority in improving teacher quality, we heard from principals that they needed more training on how to be effective supervisors and evaluators. So that's people that have had lots of experience visiting classrooms, doing staff assessments, evaluating educators, but all 15 of the people in our division, all 15 school principals said they needed additional training. So if you think about around your board table, how much training have you had, how much conversation have you had about what you can do to be effective supervisors in evaluation or evaluators of your divisional administrator? Now, it needn't be formal training, but such formal training is available. For example, Janice Arnold, whose office I'm sitting in right now, does training on improving evaluation for board members, both in terms of self-evaluation of the board and evaluating your CEO superintendent. And she's available, and I'm sure Janice would welcome an email or phone call if you'd like her to come out and start that conversation with you. It can also be informal. You can sit around and reflect upon what have we done already as a board to evaluate our superintendent, and what do we want to do to make this even more effective. And what you might consider doing is looking at articles or maybe doing a book study and having conversations about what you can do to improve your practice. For example, I mentioned already about the importance of the process being collaborative. Perhaps in September at a board meeting you want to talk about whether or not your supervision and evaluation of your education leader is collaborative, and if not, what you can do to improve that. And the best way to make it collaborative is to have that conversation with your superintendent present. Now, I've been using the word evaluation throughout my presentation so far, but the word I should be using is assessment. And assessment and evaluation mean two different things in an educational setting. And frequently use the distinction when we're talking about how we assess student progress, but perhaps it's a good framework for considering how you assess the progress of your superintendent. In a classical sense, most people would agree that assessment is about increasing quality, whereas evaluation is about judging quality. From my experience, from my own 10 years as a divisional administrator and from talking to colleagues, much of the superintendent evaluation that exists in Manitoba is about judgment of quality. It's a summative document given at the end of the year that tells you whether or not you've had a good year or not, and perhaps which things that you need to consider to improve upon for next year. What we probably should be doing with supervising our superintendents is assessing their progress. And assessment suggests more of a formative, ongoing process, and it's about increasing the quality. So instead of waiting till the end of the school year, May or June, to tell the superintendent how they've done, why not meet with them early in November and talk about how they're doing and ask them how they're doing. And from them, perhaps, you can get a sense of what they will do to improve over the next couple of months. And you'll also have an opportunity as a board to say, we would like you to focus on this. Or even some positive critical feedback about, we would like to see improvement in this area. If you wait till the end of the school year, you're going to be waiting till the following school year to see what that improvement might look like. So I've said it before, and it's a common theme in the way I assess my own staff, and I suggest it might be good practice for assessing your divisional leader. Make it an ongoing process, and make it something that is a living, breathing experience where you talk to the superintendent on a regular basis about how they're doing and what they're going to do next to get better. So there's lots of different sources and research and things that you can read in terms of what you perhaps might consider to improve evaluation at a school division level, whether it be for a superintendent or for a teacher. But I'm going to suggest that many of the themes and concepts are consistent for multiple employee groups. You want to provide opportunities, firstly, for personal professional development. This is really important, and I'll give you a quick perspective. Early on, when I was a new divisional administrator, I was very reluctant to leave the school division. I felt that I needed to be in the division every single day, and I thought if I was away and something happened that I was needed, it would be a negative reflection of my commitment to the school division. And it took me a couple of years to realize that if I just sat in my office, I might get better just with experience, but I was lacking that professional development. So I think it's really important that you and the superintendent sit down to talk about what will you do to get better this year, and what training or PD do you require to help you get better. Another important point for evaluation is it needs to be focusing on improving performance, not proving incompetence. And I've said this multiple ways, and it's a common theme, but it's about making the superintendent get better, not about catching them doing a poor job. Of course, it also has to provide the legal, realistic, accurate, useful, and measurable criteria reflective of the competencies. I'm going to speak to this later, but it has to be about sitting down with the superintendent and saying very clearly at the start of the year, this is what you will be evaluated on. These are the things that we're looking for you in terms of your performance, upon which we will make judgments about your quality. You cannot have things that you evaluate the superintendent on that are not reflected in the job description. And that's essentially, that's very important, but it's very essential if you're having a superintendent that is struggling, or if worse, you have a superintendent for whom you're considering dismissal. If you evaluate those people on anything outside of what you agreed upon at the beginning as the stated criteria, the expectations of the job, it will not work out well generally for you if it goes to arbitration. So you have to make sure that the things that you're evaluating your division leader are things that you agreed upon at the beginning of the year or at the beginning of employment. And finally, I think it's important that superintendent evaluation be ongoing and connected to school district and school improvement goals. So I've spoke to the importance of having the superintendent identify goals, but you need to sit down with the superintendent to make sure those goals are important to your division. If the superintendent wants to be a better volleyball coach, maybe that's a good personal goal, but how is that going to make your school division get better? So it's important to try to link their goals to things that you're doing in your divisional improvement plan. Again, just a simple graphic to frame the conversation a little bit further. And if you read this, essentially, the evaluator here is telling the person that they're evaluating them as poor, so that will give them a paper trail in case they ever need to be fired. And they also suggested that it would be a good surge of motivation. My perspective on evaluation and supervision is that evaluation should really reflect upon the things that you want that person to do to get better in the future. And you could separate that from performance assessments that could be ongoing. So to give you a very simple example, if you have an issue for which that you need to talk to the superintendent, there's an aspect of their performance that you need to improve quickly, don't wait till the end of the year to tell them. Don't wait till the end of the year to put it in a formal evaluation. So to give you a simple example, and I hope that this isn't the case in any of your divisions, if you have a superintendent that comes late to work every day and you see this practice, you see this happening in November and December, don't wait till the end of the year to say you must come to work late more often. You need to sit down, perhaps the board chair and the vice chair, just to say, hey, we notice you're arriving late to work. What's going on? Is there anything we can do to help you out? That's not a supervision and evaluation issue. That's a supervision issue. So don't wait until the end of the year. And the additional thing that this graphic is suggesting is don't think that negative feedback in and of itself is going to motivate people to get better. So if you tell someone that you do a poor job visiting schools, that's not very uplifting. You want to frame it in a positive way. You need to say that, you know, our division values visibility and accessibility, and we'd really like to see you focus over the next couple of months on being present in our schools. And it's essentially the same message, and I would suggest that it's much more motivational when it's framed in a positive way. So how do we improve effectiveness of superintendent evaluation? So there's many things I spoke to already. I'm just going to try in the last two slides or last couple of slides to summarize some of the things. Again, as I stated at the beginning of the webinar, this isn't intended to be an intensive professional development session. It's just intended to give you some things to think about around the board table and perhaps help you have some conversations about what you're doing currently and what you might do to improve the practice. So firstly, I'd suggest that to improve the effectiveness of superintendent evaluation, you want to include opportunities for both self-evaluation as well as feedback from others. It's really important for the superintendent to reflect upon how the year has gone. In many cases, in my own experience, there's a form, perhaps the same form that others might fill out about how I'm doing, I fill out myself. And it's not simply suggesting that, you know, I rate myself on some numerical scale. I also have to be able to provide evidence, or what I believe to be evidence, about how I've achieved those different competencies. The second thing I might suggest, and it links to the second bullet, face-to-face meetings are essential. So I would suggest, starting at the beginning of the year, you sit down with the superintendent and talk about what the process is going to look like, and ask the superintendent, what will you do to be better this year? And then as you meet ongoing, whether it be for interim meetings, perhaps in December and February, or at that final summative meeting at the end of the year, ask the superintendent, how have you improved your practice this year? Or perhaps ask them, at the beginning of the year, you outline several goals that you might have to improve. Tell us whether or not you've met those goals and give us evidence to show that you've met those goals. I would suggest that you also want to make evaluation a separate priority from the regular board meetings. And I'm not sure what board meetings look like in your school divisions, but we have them the second and fourth Thursdays of the month in the evening, and they're often long meetings, and we have lots of board business, and we have often delegations and presentations. I would suggest that superintendent evaluation is important enough that you have it separate from what your regular business is. So what does that mean? Maybe 3 special meetings a year. Sure, there's cost in terms of board time and perhaps mileage, but this is an important practice. And you don't want to make superintendent evaluation just something that you tack on to an end of a meeting, or you put it for an hour before a regular meeting when you have 3 or 4 hours of important business to follow. So I would suggest you make them a separate priority and have separate meetings for them. I've said this before, but I need to reiterate this because it's so important. You need to have explicit criteria upon which you're going to be evaluating your superintendent, and you have to communicate those to the superintendent at the beginning of the process, and I would say it's even essential to have those in writing. And then I would say do not deter from these criteria. So if at the end of the year you state that the superintendent is a nice guy, or he's not a nice guy, or she doesn't do this enough, it needs to be reflected in the criteria. Because if you're making comments about someone's personality and there's not elements of that reflected in the competencies for the superintendent evaluation, it can cause you some trouble. I'd also say that You need to be careful not to make evaluation contentious or personal, either among the board or with the superintendent. You have to take the perspective that evaluation and supervision of your divisional leader is about helping them to get better. So you frame things in the positive, and you have to have open discussions and recognize that occasionally there may be disagreements around the board table among trustees about different criteria that you're evaluating the superintendent, or perhaps it's possible that the superintendent might object or disagree with something that you're suggesting in an evaluation. That just means it's an opportunity for conversation. It shouldn't be an opportunity for confrontation. Again, I stated earlier that supervision evaluation of superintendents is about, or could be, a way to help you develop relationships. One of the challenges when you hire a new superintendent is it takes a while to establish that relationship. So that first year can be kind of tricky and challenging. And I didn't note this in the slide, but having said it aloud, you might consider taking a lower key approach, a less intensive approach to evaluating a first year superintendent. What you might think of doing is do a more formative professional development growth model, whereby you talk to them at the beginning of the year about what their plans are to get better, and perhaps visit with them and have conversations about what have you done this year to get better, and tell us about what you accomplished this year, and then have a summative, general, broad document at the end of the year reflecting that, before you jump into an intensive summative. I'm not sure if your divisional policies or procedures allow for that, but sometimes reflecting on what you might do to improve practice may require some changes in your procedures or your policies. So a couple of final bullets about how we can improve the effectiveness of superintendent evaluation. I guess this relates to what I just stated about first year people. You may want to break the evaluation down and perhaps only look at specific things in a given year, or only look at high-level things such as leadership. I've used the term before, but often superintendent evaluation can be very onerous, especially if you have a very detailed, specific, comprehensive document or tool. You might consider not doing the whole tool or the whole evaluation every given year. Perhaps if you have 5 big areas or competencies, perhaps you look at one area every year or 2 areas a year. So maybe this year it's leadership and community relations. Next year perhaps it's board relationships and communication. The other thing you might consider, it's comparable to what many school divisions do for teachers, perhaps don't do a formal evaluation every year, because those things are very intensive and they're very important, but you need an intensive formal evaluation every single year. So if you think of the teacher model that exists in many school divisions, there's a summative formal evaluation every 3rd year with a formative professional growth model in the 2 intervening years. So it may be something that you might consider for your superintendent evaluation. I've said this already, but I think it's an important summary comment. Focus on the future, don't look at the past. Certainly you want to reflect back on the past school year and say, here's what we noted, but make the focus about here is what we would like to see in the future. And certainly, if there's been elements in previous evaluations that have been addressed, don't go revisit things if they're not important. So don't talk to the superintendent about, here's what we'd like to see improvement in, and when we evaluated you 7 years ago, we said this was important too. I'm not sure what the value of that is. You want to focus on the future and you want to make it positive and growth oriented. And this is a really important one, and probably not one that is super relevant given the current status of Bill 28, but one of the worst times that you can evaluate a superintendent is when you're in the midst of contract negotiations. Just for multiple reasons, because sometimes boards may feel the need to evaluate harshly if they're concerned about how a positive evaluation may open the door to unwarranted or unlikely or unappealing salary increases. And sometimes if there's difficult negotiations, the superintendent might think that the evaluation process is influencing that. So I'm not sure how you get around that. As I stated, Bill 28 kind of puts a hold on salary negotiations currently, but we're still going to be negotiating other elements of our contracts in the future. You may want to put some space. If it's not possible to have them in different years, make sure they're clear that they're separate. Worst case scenario, don't sit down with the superintendent in a single evening and talk about their evaluation and then say, since we're all here, let's do our salary negotiation now, because there could be a perception that they're linked and we don't want that to be the case. Just a couple of slides to finish it off. How to prepare for the process. I would say that it's really important for trustees to be prepared in advance. So that's conversations with each other and with the superintendent about what the process is going to look like, a detailed plan for how you're going to complete the process during the school year, as well as what specific measures you're going to evaluate. Again, there's common themes that I've repeated over and over, and I'm hoping that there are things that you take away for consideration. So one of the things I recall when Janice Arnold visited our division, she talked about how it's important to evaluate both the what and the how of the superintendent's work. So the what references the measurable goals. Here are the things I'm going to try to improve upon this year, and here's how I'm going to do it. And the how references the specific things that are outlined in the superintendent job description. And while I've stated it before, I'm going to state it again because it's really important. Make sure the things you evaluate are the things that you've agreed upon at the start of the year, and don't divert from those things. Because diverting from those things can get you in trouble if there's contentious issues that come up, and it can get you in a lot of trouble if things that you evaluate are being used for dismissal or perhaps punitive reasons, and they're not reflected in the job description. And I would say, if nothing, there's nothing more important for me as an evaluator of my own staff, and there's nothing more important for me as someone being evaluated as a board, by a board, that the process needs to be collaborative. Superintendents want to be involved from the beginning. They want to give input about what's important. They want to hear from the board at the beginning of the school year about what you expect of them, and then be told very clearly about what they need to do to meet those expectations. So back to one of my initial slides, evaluation of the divisional leader has to be something that you do with the superintendent. It's not something that you do to the superintendent. So just to revisit the initial slide when I talked about why superintendent evaluation is important, and it's very straightforward. Superintendents and boards play essential roles in the performance and outcomes of school systems. Superintendents are your educational leaders. They're your single most important employee in your school division. If they're getting better, the hope would be that your school division is getting better. And the final statement, I'm just going to read it aloud because I think it speaks to the process very clearly, and it's a nice summary statement. Fair, valid, and objective evaluation of superintendent's performance is imperative for supporting the work of the superintendent, and it's imperative for making your school division get better, and it's imperative for holding the system accountable for success. See, I have a question somebody that's watching the webinar has just sent, and I'm just going to read the question and I'll try to speak to it from my perspective. So the question is, should all board members be involved in the formal year-end evaluation, or can comments or feedback be given to the ad hoc committee and have it led by them? I think it depends on your board and the size of your board and the nature of your board and what your practice is for dealing with these kind of things. Certainly, there's value in having a small group of people focusing attention on a task and perhaps summarizing for the rest of the board. So if you might consider having an ad hoc committee that collects feedback from stakeholders, gets feedback from trustees, principals, divisional people, and summarizes that and brings it back to the board. And perhaps as a full board, you have conversations about what the final evaluation might look like. And then you might have that ad hoc committee meet with the superintendent to present them with the final evaluation. However, I also know that some boards have fairly small memberships. So I would suggest that if you have 4 or 5 board members for your whole division, that might be the ad hoc committee, and that might be sufficient. I would say it is important, though, if you go with a subcommittee of the board, that it's clear to both the board and the superintendent that the evaluation is the responsibility of everyone together. All board members are responsible for the evaluation of the superintendent, and the superintendent is responsible as well. So what I might suggest is, if you plan to meet with the superintendent, those face-to-face meetings that I suggested, perhaps what you would do would be to have the whole board present at the beginning to talk about here's what the process is going to look like. And you might want to have the whole board present at the end of the year when you talk to the superintendent about their year and have them reflect upon their impact. But perhaps in those interim meetings during the school year, it might be just the ad hoc committee. And I would suggest that that committee could be comprised of any of your trustees, but I would suggest it's really important that the board chair or vice chair is part of that committee. So I'm going to sign off now, and I'm just going to flip to the final page here on the presentation. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that the Manitoba School Board Association, in conjunction with MAS, developed a really great document to help support school boards in their own evaluation and in the evaluation of the superintendent. And it's called Leading Together, a resource guide for school board superintendents and secretary treasurers. So I'd suggest, I think it's about page 22 to 24, 22 to 25, that outlines the process for superintendent evaluation. And it's definitely worth a look if you currently don't have a framework to use yourself. You needn't necessarily use that exact framework, but it will certainly give you ideas about what you might do to improve the practice of supervising and evaluating your divisional administrator. That's it for me today. I just want to thank you so much for your attention and suggest that if you have any questions of me, feel free to contact me at Park West School Division. You can just go on the divisional website and you can get either my email or phone number. As I stated at the beginning, I'm not suggesting that I'm a definitive expert on superintendent evaluation. I am someone that's very passionate about improving the professional quality of people in our system, whether they be teachers, educational assistants, or myself as a divisional leader. And I'd welcome a conversation and welcome your own insight if you want to share it with me about what you do to effectively evaluate your divisional leader. So thanks again. Have a great day and enjoy your school year. Best of luck for a really exciting and positive year.